The first point I would like to raise is really about the definition of dissemination. What is dissemination? Linguistically, it is the act or the process of disseminating, spreading the word, spreading something, the state of being disseminated, whether dissemination of ideas, of findings, of messages. The key consideration in the dissemination process is the message. So before you begin your research or research writing, it is worth thinking about a few points related to dissemination and to make sure you get it right. You get it right in terms of the nature of the message, the type of the message, and to whom it's going to be communicated. Sometimes it is perhaps better to have a dissemination plan even before you start the research activity. All in all, dissemination is about communication. So, and these points emerge if we consider it part of communication, whether written or oral. What kind of message, what message we are trying to communicate? What is your message? What is the message you are trying to communicate are important questions. To whom? Basically, the audience. Who is this message for? For example, is it for professionals or professional organizations or policy and decision makers or the academic community or a combination of these? By whom or who is the messenger is really important. Who and where should it come from? This is really very important, especially when working in research teams that have different types of expertise, and the research team might or could have a speaker on behalf of the team. So who's going to do the communication is really important, whether in writing or a presentation or a press release or anything. How, which is about the method of communication. What are the best ways to communicate your message, oral, written, or both? Also, it is important to think about timing. When would it be best or the best time to communicate the message? As key milestone, for example, of the research activity. Sometimes we have packages of research packages or research modules. So once a module is completed, we disseminate or what? Or we wait until the entire research activity is completed and then we disseminate. Or we disseminate as the research progresses. These are very important points to consider. There are different schools and different types, and it depends on the nature of the research activities. So in some cases, you cannot communicate findings, for example, until the entire research exercise is complete. With what effect is another question. What do you want to happen or gain from dissemination? That's an important question. Do you want to gain academic credibility? Do you want to inform policymakers? Do you want to communicate to professionals? All these are really important, which would require monitoring. And monitoring is trying to monitor the dissemination effort by seeing its impact, by looking at its impact. So basically, the message here is the core or the crux of what is being communicated. And it is not, this is a very important point, it is not what the message does for the audience. It is about what the audience does with the message. So how the message is useful for the audience. The format you use to communicate and disseminate your research and the associated message or messages is really important. And we all know the multitude of ways in which we can disseminate, from conference papers, press release, media release, research report, and all of these. They are important, but different, and speak to different audience. So these need to be considered and might include, for example, a written academic paper, as I say, a report with an executive summary, a media release, or a discussion in a meeting or a workshop, a conference presentation. All of these are important to consider as part of the dissemination plan. When it comes to timing of the message or disseminating the message, it should be noted that dissemination can also take place before, during, or after the research process. So that's very important. Noting that if the audience, for example, is professional or academic community, they will be aware of the topic you are investigating, so they are interested more in the results, not in the basic understanding of the topic. So before beginning your research, it is important to think of how do you want it to be used and whether you want it to work or you wanted the work to be academically and professionally cited or known globally, more downloaded, for example, or used to inform policy and practice. I would say here that thoughtful dissemination throughout the research process will ultimately determine how the work will be used, how the work will have an impact, at least at the level of academia. So the key points here are that dissemination is critical to the success of your research. We have seen many researchers who are excellent and managed to do excellent achievements in terms of securing significant funding, but do not disseminate their work effectively. Even if we look at it as an academic paper, we need to understand and keep the dissemination and the messages we communicate interesting, simple, and relevant to the audience. We need to diversify the dissemination effort. One finding or one issue can be presented in many different ways for different types of audience using different types of interpretations and languages. These are really very important. Capitalizing on opportunities would also be important to disseminate the work as much as possible. If you found a journal, a special or thematic issue, for example, or a conference theme that are very, very relevant to your work, do not miss the opportunity. Since this will allow you to position your work among like-minded people, people who have the same interest and the same drive with respect to the topic. Also, I would say here that do not disseminate your work within groups or communities who might not be interested in what you are communicating. That's an important point. For example, if you're adopting a research philosophy or a research topic, specific one, and you already know that this is not going to work in this conference, don't go to this conference. Go to another one that welcome your contributions. Finally, monitoring the dissemination to determine its success, learning from what worked and what didn't is really important. The preceding points cater to faculty and academics, of course, in higher education or research institutions where conducting research is a routine activity and part of the culture of the institution. For PhD students, the same apply, or even early career researchers, the same apply. It is important to share your research, to disseminate your research, especially if you are planning to have an academic career or embarking on an academic career journey. And so it is important to really develop a dissemination plan as part of a research proposal or as the proposal progresses. And that's dependent on the context. Some universities encourage publishing while conducting research and before you complete your PhD. Other universities don't encourage that and say, okay, no, for copyright purposes and for confidentiality purposes, it is important to wait until the entire research exercise is complete, and then dissemination phase starts. The dissemination plan would be a written statement on how you will communicate your research, what are the opportunities available for dissemination, exactly like the professional research in the previous slides. So basically, you have developed material that generated a message or messages that need to be communicated to a specific audience to influence or produce impact. So this applies to both, whether PhD research or academic research or professional academics. So speaking about the types of dissemination and the assessment of that dissemination, I'm referring here to the ACSA document, which is an excellent document, and trying to expand the scope of dissemination and really materialize many of the practices of architects and design researchers, documenting here, assessing the quality of architecture research and scholarship in North American universities. So the document highlights different forms of scholarship, which are very relevant to architecture and design research, including, as you can see here, curation, funding, even attempts at funding is seen as part of dissemination, attempts at seeking funding, practice recognition, publication, public presentation, and community engagement. But these should have specific qualities. So we cannot say, for example, any practice recognition would count as a form of dissemination, or any community engagement exercise would count as a form of dissemination. So they have specific parameters for assessment. Exploring these types of dissemination and the associated assessment, it is really critical for us as researchers, whether in the US context or in other contexts, to map what we do to these kind of activities or dissemination channels and the required assessment. It is important also to say that in this context, some universities have priorities. They don't recognize some of these elements or some of these dissemination channels, others do. So contextualizing the research activity to fit where you are is really important. When we look at curation, for example, it has specific parameters for assessment in terms of quality, excellence, written reviews, and reputable publications. So even if you develop an exhibition, developing an exhibition on its own is not enough, but generating a catalog, having written reviews and reputable publications is a recognizable, in general, form of dissemination. Whether it is recognized in a specific university or not, it's a different story. Internal or external funding, and whether that funding, the amount of it, the funding sources, the role in the research project, whether PI or principal investigator or co-investigator, all of these are elements to consider for assessment. And we can see all others, practice recognition, publications, public presentations, and community engagement. These are forms of dissemination, as long as they are documented, valued, they have value, they have impact, they have influence. They are relevant to architecture and to the development of the discipline. This diagram, also from the document of ACSA, to capture dissemination mechanisms and the direct, whether, yes, you can see here, direct design outcome or research and scholarship outcome, and the various forms of dissemination or associated dissemination and the potential impact. These are really very important to consider for architecture and design researchers. The forms of scholarships have been examined in the documents in the context of the United States, but it should be noted that as I said, not all of them apply to architecture and design research worldwide. Some don't recognize many of these forms of dissemination and focus only on one, which is publication. Globally and generically at the same time, one could see two university types, and that's at the global scale, type A and type B again. And these types basically set the standards and priorities of academic work, dissemination, and recognize specific forms of dissemination. Type A places emphasis in this order on research, education, industry, community. Type B places emphasis in this order also on education, scholarship, research, enterprise, and community. So one is more community-facing, enterprise-facing, industry-facing, and the other is more knowledge-based as a priority. The forms of dissemination are looked at based on the type of the university you are in. Globally also, European Research Council Associated Research Framework Program embed a number of criteria for assessing research and dissemination. And these criteria apply to architecture and design research. There are many qualities, including being bold, inspirational, have social relevance or societal relevance, clear direction, targeted, measurable, cross-disciplinary, cross-sectoral, involve multiple bottom-up solutions. All of these are elements based on the European Research Council. Relevant to architecture, RIBA and the European Association of Architecture Education have also developed some working papers and guidance on assessing research impact and dissemination, but focusing more on how it relates to practice and practice-based research. And some of these standards and guidance include many things, but all of them are relevant to design practice or are focused on design practice. In the UK context, the Research Excellence Framework applies to architecture and design research. It's founded in the early 2000s, and it focuses on three components. First of all, it assesses institutions, academic units, and individuals, or cascades to individuals. So how individual faculty within the unit of assessment that relates to architecture is architecture planning and built environment will contribute to outputs, will contribute to impact, and will contribute to environment. Each one has a definition. Outputs are basically research outputs, disseminated research, whether academic journal papers, conference papers, book chapters, books, and all kinds of outputs. However, universities are typically encouraging not to put for assessment other forms of outputs and focus on academic journal papers. And then the impact, the result of that dissemination, how the impact is seen as beyond academia, because outputs can be measured based on citation metrics and a number of parameters related to academia. But here, impact is not meant to address academic impact, but to address societal impact. Could involve impact on health, impact on education, impact on society, impact on solving a specific problem that is real world problem, and so on. The environment component is basically what kind of environment exists to support research and researchers. What concerns us in this discussion are the first 2 points, because this is more about the institution and the institutional practices. More. So the first two are of concern to us and relevant to us. Outputs are assessed based on star ratings. Star ratings means 4 stars, 3 stars, 2 stars, 1 stars, and each of them means something. 4 stars mean world leading, 3 stars internationally excellent, 2 stars internationally recognized, 1 star nationally recognized, 0 is not recognized. The impact beyond academia is also based on reach and significance, how the work has influenced societies or communities or groups of people. And I would say these standards of research excellence, whether in the US or the UK or regionally or globally, are changing the landscape of the expectations of faculty and academics in architecture and allied disciplines, where dissemination research or dissemination of research is clearly on the rise. It's clearly becoming a requirement. And this leads us to the third component of this talk, which focuses on dissemination through publication. Here I'm focusing on journal publishing and some of the associated metrics. We have seen that assessment methods adopted by universities regarding assessment frameworks are heavily relying on dissemination, which can take different forms based, as I said, on the higher education system or university systems within which they are undertaking. Perhaps it would take really significant time to address all of these forms of outputs or dissemination separately. So I'm focusing here on academic journal papers, but probably subsequent discussions can take place to address other forms of dissemination. I would say here refer to my own experience because these tips or these guidance points are based on approaching now 20 years experience with being a founder of Archnet-IJAR, International Journal of Architecture Research, which occupies a central position in the top 20% in the list of journals, which is unusual for a journal that focuses on architecture, doesn't have hardcore sciences. And also being the co-chief editor of Open House International, a journal that had a very strong international reputation, and it's a 45 years old journal, and it had a very strong presence where research in architecture and urbanism was in its infancy, was really at the very, very beginning. It's also based on efforts in developing 10 special issues of Open House International before their acquisition by Emerald Publishing Group. So first of all, these are the guidance points regarding disseminating for a journal contribution, for academic paper to be published in a journal. So the most important thing is to write to address the criteria. So you can write the research, the draft paper, but then start to look at it from a critical perspective and whether it meets the criteria. And most of the journals make these criteria explicit in their web pages. And it is important to ask yourself the same set of questions that reviewers are asked by the journal to use when doing the reviews. So basically, if you are able to approximate your contribution in the paper to these questions, then it is likely the paper will be accepted, whether after iterations of reviews or immediately. But there are 6 key elements that I will go through one by one. Number one is originality. Most journals require original work. work that has not been published elsewhere. And these questions related to originality could be, for example, does the paper contain new and significant information adequate to justify publication? Even if you have a good paper, but doesn't have enough new information, it doesn't justify publication. Relationship to the current body of knowledge, relationship to the literature. Does the paper demonstrate an adequate understanding of the relevant literature? Relevant literature here is really very important. It must be related to the field of the paper, citing an appropriate range of literature sources. Reviewers also look at whether significant and important work has been ignored in terms of the literature. That's really important to look at. The methodology, the argument of the paper, does it build on an appropriate base of theory or concepts or other ideas? Has the researcher an equivalent intellectual work on which the paper is based been well designed? So the design of the methodology, the way the work is structured are really very important. Are the methods employed appropriately? These are important questions related to methodology. Then developing the results. Are they presented clearly, analyzed appropriately? Do the conclusion adequately tie with the literature explored and other elements of the paper? And then, which is really very important, many journals don't look at this, practicality. What are the implications, whether social implications, environmental implications, professional implications, policy implications? These are really very important because it demonstrates the contribution of the work, contribution of the paper. And then communication, which is about questions like, does the paper clearly express its case? That's an important one. Measured, again, is the technical language of the field. Some people, for example, if you're writing for a history journal, you have to speak the history language that historians speak. If you don't, and even if the material within the paper is valuable, likely the work will be rejected. Has attention been paid or given to the clarity of expression, readability, sentence structure, jargon use, abbreviations and acronyms, and all of these elements, and there's no doubt graphics here also are very critical for us. So these are 6 elements that basically, if you address them, likely the work will be published. One key tip is to write without introducing too many controversial issues. Clarity. Don't generate a battlefield in the writing by juxtaposing too many concepts and too many ideas. Still, you can submit to impress, basically, not just to submit, but without a controversial tone. The writing and submission process should not be seen as a painful process because it's a very lengthy process, but it is a process that requires patience, enjoyment, coupled with rigor, originality, innovation. But you should enjoy it. If you don't enjoy it, then this is not for you. So demonstrate that in the submission. An important point to make here is that you really need to understand the nature of the journal and its scope. And that's really very important. Basically, understand what you are submitting to. You can look at recent publications that published by the journal, recent authors published in the journal, their profile, where they're from, the nature of the content, whether it's more empirical, more conceptual, more technical, more theoretical. All of these elements are really important. You can also use a paper that you believe distinct from that journal and follow its sequence in terms of approach, the way they lay out the issues and they lay out the problem and objectives. Some journals include a sample paper, which you can also put next to you as you develop your own paper. Compliance is critical. Many papers get rejected because they don't address the submission requirements, especially length requirements, for example. The journal says 10,000 words maximum, don't submit 14,000. So it's a key to get your paper considered for review. And I would say not following the requirements basically exposes your work and yourself to early judgment from the editor and the associate editors who make decisions on whether to consider the paper for review or not. So it's really important to comply with the submission requirements, writing style of the journal, referencing, and all of these aspects. Literature review doesn't have to be called literature review, depending on the case you are trying to make within the paper. Some consider it as a theoretical base or theoretical underpinnings upon which the case is based. Some consider it as an evidence of a specific knowledge gap. So how you're going to treat the literature review is really important. In all cases, it should be balanced, the right choice of relevant literature that you are citing to include state-of-the-art literature and classical literature. This is just a general advice. Cite from the same journal also. Why? Because many journals would like to maintain continuity in the discourse that they are generating to demonstrate that there is a school of thinking among its authors and contributors. That's important. And it's important for you to show familiarity with the journal also. That's really one of the important issues. Self-citation, consider it when necessary. When you have to cite yourself or cite some of your work, it is fine as long as it's building on certain things you have published in the past. Content and context. Some journals, when we look at the content, for example, some of them focus on specific interest or focus on a specific context. Others are more diverse. Some journals try to look at implications to meet wider audience or wider interest of their readership base. So these are important elements. Consider whether the university is open to address, sorry, the journal is open to address any context for submissions from any context. So in some cases, for example, some scholars write about a very niche area and a very small context in a small village somewhere in the world that don't fit really. You cannot develop generalizations out of this, and therefore implications are not easy to grasp, and therefore editors would not welcome contributions of this nature. It is also critical to think of the ideology of the journal in terms of methods, frameworks, approaches to investigation. As I mentioned, if you're submitting to a historical journal, it's very different. Let's say, if you're submitting to Journal of Architecture or Architecture Theory Review, it's very different from submitting a paper to Architecture Science Review or Design Studies. They have their own languages, paradigms of thinking, and schools of thinking. So being familiar with this before you submit is important. And this means what kind of frameworks they adopt, what kind of approaches they follow, theoretical, historical, and all of this. Adopt and practice a positive attitude, considering that this is a very lengthy process. Sometimes papers take a year and a half, and sometimes more until they get published. So it's really important to address the reviewer's comments as thoroughly and as candidly as possible, while ensuring to minimize rebuttal and disagreement with the reviewer, unless it's really necessary, unless the reviewer doesn't see the point that you are making in the papers, then you can make a rebuttal. But if you do it positively. Communication, as we said, is critical. Balancing text, images, diagrams, graphs, correctness of references, quality of language, expressions are all critical aspects of dissemination and publishing an academic paper. Now, understanding some of the metrics is really important. It looks like I'm exceeding the time a bit. So what I'm going to do is probably I will skip a couple of slides, but understanding some of the metrics is really important for dissemination. The reason is that we want to understand the quality of the dissemination channels we are using. So what are the relevant impact metrics for scholars? Most impact metrics are focused on science. Some are focusing on social sciences, but the majority are STEM biased, and I'll show a couple of examples here. So that question about the relevant metrics in terms of identifying a journal or even determining the quality of a scholarly activity of an individual. These are really important based on some of the current arguments. There is no metric suitable for architectural design research. A combination of metrics would give a better picture. If we look at Scopus, Web of Science, Google Scholar, ResearchGate, and others, maybe we can have a picture about a specific area or a specific field or an individual. But I want to refer here to two important articles related to architecture and design research, and also to seeing architecture research as part of arts and humanities. The first article is about citation analysis and tenure metrics in art and architecture and design related disciplines. This is a very, very important article. And the second one is basically arguing that metrics don't work for arts and humanities. So trying to develop that argument. So collectively, they suggest that architecture and design research continues to fall within the areas of scholarships in a number of areas: arts, humanities, social sciences, design studies, engineering, and technology. And it is a challenge. They also suggest that all metrics are STEM biased. They don't consider architecture unless the architecture research introduced is really following the sciences and the engineering disciplines. This is evident in the ranking of journals. If you look at the ranking of journals, you will see that some very well-known, very well-established journals are scoring very low in these metrics, and some very new, less than 5 years old, science-based journals are scoring high. So that's an important differentiation that we need to be aware of. We're not going to change the ranking metrics or do any of that, but it's really important to think of what we are looking at or for. The articles also suggest that there are flaws in the current citation system because you cannot determine quality. And this includes lack of a way to denote or represent quality in these metrics, the quality of the research, stating that furthering the discipline of architecture and within arts and humanities is more important than citations and citation metrics. The goal of research in arts and humanities is originality, new knowledge, and that quality may suggest reach. So you can see lots of citations for an article. Yes, it suggests reach, but is not necessarily suggesting significance. The strange thing in one of these articles is that there is, they have a strong argument against high citation counts